So testing is a really important topic. And the goal of today's lecture is twofold. The first goal is to show an example of how to set up some basic tests for your front end. The other goal really is to learn about testing concepts and jargon. And I don't mean jargon like in a negative way, pejoratively, just like to describe the industry terms. And this is going to be really valuable for interviews and for your career, and understand why engineering organizations care about testing. So the value of testing, I think one way to demonstrate it would be, I'm going to quickly go to like the Nordstrom's website. And we're going to look at it and we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to pick out a feature on the Nordstrom's website and very briefly talk about it. And I don't know exactly why I chose Nordstrom's, though I will say, if it's still the case, they actually at one point had like, I think a really strong like engineering department. Let's see if we can find their tech blog. So it looks like it hasn't been updated since 2018. But there was a while where like there were a lot of articles for like Nordstrom's software engineering that I was reading about. So that's obviously the wrong blog. And that's probably still the case. Like I actually would add them. Like here's an article about being a software engineering intern at Nordstrom from 2020. So that's not from too long ago. So actually I'll throw that in the chat. And they're not a bad company to add to your list. I've always kind of had my eye on them, to be honest, and just never pulled the trigger. I know it's kind of funny. You know, you don't think about it with Nordstrom's. But let's talk about testing. So here's the Nordstrom's.com homepage, right? And the thing to remember is that like, basically a ton of studies show that users buy more stuff when everything is faster and smoother on the website. And a lot of the UI patterns that we see these days, there's a lot of data that's been collected to see like what user interface patterns work well in terms of like making things easier for users and like how that translates to like business outcomes, essentially of users buying stuff. So a lot of seemingly small UI things can have like larger business implications in terms of the company doing well and making money and so on. And a great example actually is right here, this little 40% off with the 65 marked out. Like I'm gonna kind of like tell a little story around this feature and we'll talk about the value of tests in doing so. And then we'll kind of circle back to walking through how to build and write tests. But so this feature here has two parts, three parts really. The first part is the price in red, $38.90. The second part is this information that this is 40% off. And if we're developers writing this feature and you know our product manager says, hey, I want to be able to show that this is 40% off, we have to know not just the new price, but the old price to calculate that percentage. Or we have to be like, awesome, where do we get that data from? And maybe that data is in a database somewhere. And then the third part of the feature is displaying the original price and then having this crossed out. So there's actually a lot of complexity here because this is potentially 3 separate pieces of data that are related. And then we also have to know, hey, this item is on sale, display the price information this way. So let's say that like parts of this have been implemented already, the sale price, that it's 40% off, but we are now adding the new feature of this $65 being crossed off. So that's the new feature that we are building. And our product manager has said, studies show that user click-through rates improve by, I don't know, maybe 2% when they see the original price crossed off like this, right? For the same reason that everything costs like, 90 cents or 99 cents, because it kind of encourages people's buying behavior. So for Nordstrom's, like a 2% increase in click-through rate, I don't know how much money, but that's potentially a lot of money. 2% I feel like is actually pretty big for a big company like Nordstrom's. And for a feature like this at a company like Nordstrom's, when this feature is shipped, there would also be like analytics to track the performance of this feature. And they would probably do even A/B testing where maybe like 10% of users would see this new feature. And we would track like, does this increase click-through rates? Does this increase like purchase rates? Like that's all very common things that happen at startups that I've been at, and certainly at a big company like Nordstrom's. So it's not just about this feature, it's also about writing a lot of code then to track, all right, is this doing what we want to help move the business forward? So, once you're kind of building stuff like that, and there's a lot of downstream consequences of the feature behaving correctly, it's really important for us to have confidence and certainty that this feature is going to work. And that's where testing starts to come in, because I guarantee like there is a lot of moving parts on this website, just even for the front end and maybe even for the back end. And like that the engineering team here is large. I would have to imagine dozens of people, maybe more, I don't know. And so, like for our personal projects, for example, you all are doing informal QA and testing right now. You write the feature and you click around and see if it works. And that's exactly what we would do when developing this too. But then when it comes time to like, if like the VP of product is like, what's the status on this? They don't care about the tech details. They want to know like, is this moving the needle? And once you kind of have to, there is like reporting up the chain in the company about like what this feature is doing. That's where you don't want to rely on like looking around and manually clicking to make sure that this works. We're having tests which are automatable. So before we push any new change to the Nordstrom's website, we confirm that all of our features are working, that are reliable and repeatable. And tests give the business certainty that things are behaving as expected. So hopefully that makes sense about why, like, even for a small feature like this, part of my job writing this feature would be to write tests for it to make sure that it is showing up the way we want, that it's showing up on the website, and also to make sure that something else doesn't accidentally break it. A regression is when you like if we find a bug and fix it and then accidentally do something to reintroduce that bug, that would be a regression. A regression would also be if we add this feature as a React component and then maybe someone else accidentally removes that React component when working on a different feature, our site would regress. It would go backwards, right? That feature would be gone. tests are great at catching regressions. So does that make sense to folks? And do people have any questions around this so far? And hopefully this also kind of illustrates why engineering orgs care about tests. It gives us certainty about our application behavior. And this lets us like make commitments to the business with less pain, essentially. Tests alone are insufficient. Like a test is only as good as what you're testing for. If we don't think about writing a test for something, then we'll never catch it. A company like Nordstrom's will also have a QA process with humans involved, as will really any business that has an engineering team and a consumer-facing product. And often we'll have a human QA team combined with automated testing. So tests at the end of the day are a pragmatic tool. And a testing strategy is never developed in isolation. It will depend on the size of the company, what the other QA processes are, and things like that. So who writes tests? There's essentially two approaches. One is developers test their own code. And the other is there could be a dedicated test, or you'll see the term QA engineering. I would say within the tech industry, and particularly in startups, developers testing their own code is preferred a bit. I tend to think this has been my experience, and I think there are a lot of positives. Developers, we are going to understand the feature the best to test it. If I have to explain my code to someone else and then they write tests for it, there's a lot of information that gets lost in that process. And this approach gives developers more ownership and responsibility of their features. I think the dedicated test approach, it probably, again, this is a bit outside my experience, but if you're writing software for an airplane or a car, for mission critical software, then I could see having a dedicated testing team be its own thing, because the importance of testing is that much more. And so we really, you need people who are focused on that, and they would work very closely with the developers. For our purposes, we will be talking about when developers test their own code. This is most likely what you'll see in the industry. Again, if you move into like a role at a bank or a role involving something in the defense, national security field, or a very large corporation, that may not be the case. I think for smaller companies, it usually is. Regardless, understanding the importance of testing and be able to talk about it knowledgeably is really important. And it is, I don't want to say it's like something that comes up commonly in interviews, but being able to talk about it in interviews is a big plus. So I talked a bit about the value of testing and why to write tests. I'm just going to kind of expand on that a bit. And actually, right here at the top, I want to put, it is a huge plus to understand testing when you're looking for a job. Because it indicates that you are kind of understanding as a software engineer whose job is to deliver business value, like to be pragmatic, why we care about testing for the organization. It demonstrates professional understanding, right? There's sort of this difference between learning to program for its own sake or for academia, and specifically programming, I would say, as a professional career, particularly in the for-profit world. And it also demonstrates understanding of how tests improve reliability. This is especially true for large applications. For something like our personal project, like if I was doing it for fun, I probably wouldn't write tests. If it started to get users where I want to really make sure the site doesn't fail, I might start writing tests. For like a big complex project, even if it was something that I was doing on my own, at some point I might start writing tests because it makes my life easier. So let's talk about how tests improve the code base and the development experience. And actually, let me just check in. I know I've been talking a lot. I think as we dig into this, we'll have time where we can kind of talk through scenarios a bit more. But I'm just curious if folks have any questions or thoughts or are curious about anything. Okay, cool. Yeah, and again, really the main takeaway for today is to understand why testing is important for your employer and for you, both as a job hunter and as someone entering the profession as a software engineer. And then the other thing is we'll look at a bit of code and kind of see how to get started with it. So tests can give us confidence in our logic. I mentioned checking for regressions, but I'll mention it again. This is a really big one. It gives us confidence in refactoring our code. I know I've talked to a couple folks who ran into this, but has anyone had an experience working on your personal projects where you got something working, but you kind of want to make it better, and in doing so, you accidentally introduced a bug?
Totally in that problem right now. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's, to be completely honest, I think that's part of just the learning process of becoming a software developer with these bigger projects. And there's really kind of two approaches to make that less frequent. This is also why, like, if you folks haven't noticed, like, software engineers can get a little obsessive about like self-monitoring and self-improvement and things like that. And it can go too far. But this is also a part of it. Like, part of your journey is going to be kind of being aware of like, all right, what is my workflow? What is my technique of writing code? What is my craft? And like, what can I do to get better at it? Better meaning more consistent, create less bugs, which makes my life easier and creates less stress for me. And for this personal project, to be completely honest, I think it would be tough to write tests, both because we're new to testing and tests do introduce time. That's one of the trade-offs that we'll talk about later with testing. And also we're not probably quite there yet in terms of application size. Though, Alicia, I remember you said you were working on a multiplayer game. So there might be some areas where you might, but this is a huge part of testing. On a complex app, like, once I get a feature working, I can write a test for it that's testing its behavior. And then if I want to refactor that feature, I can do a little bit of work, run my test, and if the test breaks, that tells me that I have a bug. And in fact, there's a term for this when we're working on legacy code bases. Legacy code bases are code bases that are older, which generally means they're less well documented, and sort of the tribal knowledge of how everything works has been lost. So they're notoriously difficult to work with. And refactoring large enterprise legacy code bases is a challenging and lucrative part of the tech industry. And the term that I've encountered is called writing a test harness, which I believe was introduced in this book about refactoring by the software engineer named Martin Fowler, who kind of has a reputation of being someone who's written a lot about best practices, I think a variety of things in the industry. This is on like one of those lists of books that every software engineer should read at some point, and I haven't read it, but one day I will. And a lot of this knowledge has gotten like dispersed through the industry too. So another advantage of testing is it helps us with continuous delivery. Continuous delivery is like deploying our code, I should say rather, to our production environment, which, as we saw with Raphael's lecture, that can have several steps. And, for a large website like Nordstrom, even more so, especially because nothing gets deployed to the Nordstrom website without going through a QA process. And so if we set up a bunch of automated testing that runs every time we create a pull request on GitHub, that makes this deploying code to production process a lot smoother. And if I can safely deploy code to production for the Nordstrom's website once a week, or maybe even multiple times a day, if I have enough automation and testing in place, that lets our engineering team work a lot faster. I mentioned prevents regressions, prevents bugs from reoccurring, but I'm going to mention it again. And a regression is a great piece of knowledge to know. You know, if you get a chance to talk about it in an interview and testing and regressions and like using that word, again, that just indicates kind of like an understanding of our professional task. And the last one, and this one I didn't understand for a while and is also super valuable, is that testing serves as like strong documentation for code. If we keep our tests up to date, the tests for a class or function tell us a lot about the intent and behavior of that class. And in a lot of ways, that can be easier than reading through documentation, and it can be easier to keep tests up to date than documentation. Ideally, you do want both, but like tests as documentation is increasingly a standard practice in the industry. Where the test is maybe like at least 50% of the documentation of some function or behavior. Does that part make sense to folks? I know that we haven't seen that, so I want to make sure that I didn't inadvertently like get too abstract or anything like that. Okay. Awesome. Why don't we take like a 10-minute break? If that's good for folks, and then we can start talking about the different kinds of testing. Does that sound good for people now? I'm kind of thinking it might be good for us just to break rather than go like 10 more minutes into like a new topic and then break. Okay, awesome.